Hi, I'm Clyde Haberman of the New York Times, filling in for Sam Roberts. It's been quite a few days of tumult in global affairs. Britain's prime minister resigned, Japan's former prime minister was assassinated, Sri Lanka's president fled for his life, Israel's government collapsed, and Vladimir Putin held a meeting with both Iran and Turkey to shore up support for Russia's campaign in Ukraine. Helping us to make sense of all these flashpoints is Steve Erlanger, the chief diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times. He joins us from Brussels. Welcome, Steve, and thank you. A question I asked of folks a few months ago boiled down to basically, how will this Russian invasion of Ukraine end? But I'm wondering now, is the right question, will this Russian invasion end?
Well, everything ends, right? But we don't know when. And if you believe Vladimir Putin, it will only end eventually, either with his own death or the subjugation of Ukraine into the Russian Federation, because Putin does seem to believe Ukraine doesn't exist as a separate state, and the Ukrainians and Russians are one people. But I think that's going to be very hard for him to do. I think this will go in stages. At the moment, we're in a kind of dreary, sad war of attrition, which is a lot of artillery and not much movement on the ground. If the Ukrainians, with the help of more Western artillery, sophisticated drones, etc., can hold the Russians back until we get into the fall and the sort of colder season, then I think we're in another kind of place where fighting will halt for a while and people will replenish on both sides. The Ukrainian hope is that with these new arms and some counterattacks in the south especially, that they can begin to push the Russians back. And if they do that, then it's possible that Vladimir Putin will say, this is enough success, and at least have a ceasefire and possible peace talks. But I think we're pretty far away from that.
If after 5 months he still only has that slice, a very important slice, I grant you, of eastern Ukraine, what possesses him to think he's going to take the entire country?
Well, I'm not sure he does anymore. I think in the end, Plan B was always probably the most serious plan, which was to extend Russian control over all of the Donbass, which he hasn't done yet.
Right.
He's taken the region, the oblast of Luhansk. He's taken some of the oblast of Donetsk, but he's got quite a long way to go. There are big cities left. If he can do that, then I think you will have an effective annexation of that territory, which is largely Russian speaking, though not all Russian loving, and that will be enough for this round. And then the hope is, at least for the West, is you put enough stuff into Ukraine that you make the rest of it indigestible, so that, you know, if Putin can simply, it's not easy, I'm not saying he's going to do it, but if he can annex this big chunk of Ukraine in the east, keep the land bridge to Crimea, and I think that would be enough for now for him to declare a significant success.
Your mention of Western support of Ukraine and Zelensky, do we have a sense of just how firm this resolve is? Will it go on indefinitely, or are there already signs of, okay, enough already? We have our own problems, and this is draining our treasuries.
There's a lot of that, I have to say. You know, even in America, which has been probably the most vocal, partly because it's farthest away, I don't know how many $40 billion gifts of aid and military supplies the US Congress is willing to keep going. I mean, Ukraine, just to stay alive, needs 5 to 7 billion a month just to keep the government going. And you have, you know, in Western Europe, you have solidarity. There's no question. But you also have a big inflation, you have big energy costs, And you have strategic division. There are some countries, particularly on the eastern flank, who were part of the Soviet Empire, had been occupied, who really want the Russians pushed back because they think feeding the tiger a little bit will make the tiger hungry. And then you have countries that want to kind of have a Cold War constrained policy, almost like a containment policy. And then you have countries that say, well, let's not push Putin into a corner, because if we do, he could escalate, and then it could all get worse, and Russia's never going to go away, and you can't defeat Russia. So at the end of the day, we're going to have relations with Russia. Now, probably not till Putin goes,
Right.
but Putin is 69, and he could be there another 5 years, 10 years. It's hard to say, but these sanctions are punishing, and they are punishing West Europeans quite a lot.
Right.
They're punishing Russia too, but over a longer period, and they have not succeeded in convincing Putin to end the war, that's for sure. So the divisions are real, and it's not clear anybody from Washington on down has a very solid consensus notion of how it should end. Everybody says, oh, it's up to the Ukrainians. But it's not always up to the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians are completely dependent on the aid Western countries give them.
Do we have any sense, since we don't have a correspondent in Russia, at least not that I know of Russian public opinion about this? Is there any dissent, or has Putin managed to squelch it entirely, or is it just simply their own patriotic fervor and believing that indeed this is a war of liberation of the Nazified Ukraine, which is absurd, but there it is.
Well, it's very hard to know completely, but there is something called the Levada Institute, which is a pretty good opinion polling firm in Russia. And for the most part, it shows a lot of support for the war, because the war is seen as a patriotic war. Yeah. But Putin has also been very careful not to call it a war. I mean, he calls it a special military operation. He hasn't mobilized men, because he risks more dissent if he does that. There's more and more information getting out to Russia about casualties. There are more and more mothers who know their sons have been killed. The Russians have also been very, very careful to use soldiers and conscripts from outside the big cities, which is where most of the anti-Putin feeling is. And of course, state television, state propaganda is very, very strong. And you can get thrown into jail for criticizing too publicly, right, or too loudly. So, you know, even if you're inside Moscow, it's very hard to get a sense of what the provinces really feel. But for the moment, Putin's managed to keep life in the big cities fairly much as it was before. He stabilized the currency, and for the moment, he seems to have the support of people he needs. The most important question is the people around him, the so-called Siloviki, the strongmen. If the war is going to end, it will end because they come to Putin and say it's causing too much pain, right, too much economic strain, too much difficulty. Let's find a way out of it. I don't think public opinion in Russia is going to make much difference, to be honest.
Right. Let me switch to another region. You and I both are former Jerusalem bureau chiefs. As we're recording this, President Biden is in Israel, heading then to Saudi Arabia. Israel is about to have its 5th parliamentary election in 4 years. Is their system of government broken? I mean, some would say the same about the American system of government, but is it simply a parliamentary form that doesn't work anymore?
Oh, it's very hard to say that. I mean, what you have is a very powerful figure in Bibi Netanyahu, who still, rather like Trump, controls his own party. And his own party is probably the largest party. Now, it's not the party that can win a majority by itself, so it's always a matter of finding coalitions. I've always felt, the Israeli system would be better if it had a higher threshold of votes to get seats into parliament.
That's the key.
That's
problem
the key,
there.
because you have all these little parties who get seats and who represent real, but very often very small interest groups. Whether it's the ultra religious, or it's the national religious, or it's liberals or left.
Right.
But one thing that's happened since we were both there is it's become a much more center-right country, I think. It's the sort of Labour Party has been in real difficulty. It has never resolved the question of what to do with the Palestinians, what to do with Israeli Arabs, what to do with Bedouins. It's a very successful country. I mean, it's a very powerful country. Its defense capacity is extraordinary. It's still pretty liberal in terms of the press and so on. It has a lively debate. It's fun to talk to people there. But as a governing system, it is very, very much riven. And interestingly, I think the big immigration of Russian Jews has pushed Israel to the right, because they are, for the most part, very tough about the Arab world, very tough on what's going to happen to the Palestinians. And then the Palestinians themselves are kind of locked into this Abu Mazen, who is getting old, there hasn't been a real election in a really long time. And to some degree, I always feel the biggest problem is that it's not just that the two peoples have lost faith in each other, but in some ways they've lost faith in themselves.
But beyond that, I wonder, given Israel's increasing relationships with various Arab states in varying degrees, we've only got about a minute and a half here, but has a good chunk of the rest of the Arab world just given up on the Palestinians and are just tired of that whole issue, and not to mention the Palestinians' own inability to really press their own agenda favorably?
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, Israel has been so successful, particularly in terms of technology and military matters and trade, that the Arab world's moving on. There's no question about that. At the same time, the Palestinian issue is an unhealed wound, and you'll never get real normalization between Israel and the Arab world until there's some kind of solution. Now, whether that's a federated state, whether it's the fading hope that I have of a two-state solution, no major Arab leader can simply say, I don't care about the Palestinian question.
Yeah.
They have to care, and they should care.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you. New York Times Chief Diplomatic Correspondent Stephen Erlanger. Up next, unmasking the editorial board. Since 1896, the New York Times editorial board has consisted of opinion journalists with a shared view of important issues. The board doesn't speak for the newsroom, but much isn't really known about the makeup of the board and how it comes up with its opinions, that is, till now. Joining me is the opinion editor of the New York Times, Kathleen Kingsbury. Welcome, Katie. I appreciate it.
Hi, Kate. Thank you for having me.
Any reader can see that the number of editorials has declined greatly. There are maybe now 3 a week. Once upon a time, not all that long ago, there were 3 a day. What accounts for this kind of shift? And in your view, you've been heading that page now for 2 years or so. What should this valuable piece of newspaper real estate be used for?
Yeah, I think your question is actually getting at 2 things at work. First, yes, you are correct. We have made a very concerted choice over the past year or so to bring down the number of editorials to 1 per week. And we did that because, Yes, we believe that having that additional time to report and research and discuss what our editorial points will be will give the institutional voice, we'll be able to deploy the institutional voice with more pointedly and with more impact. I think the second part of your question is really a response to the significant investment and growth that the Times has put into opinion over the last 5 years or so. We have more staff than we've ever had before. That staff is spread across the globe. And we are doing now opinion across a portfolio of teams and in mediums that we were never doing before 2017 or so. So for instance, we won the Times won its first Oscar for an opinion video this year.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
On behalf of the Academy.
You see someone like Ezra Klein, who is obviously a columnist in print, but he also does a podcast.
Right.
And then we have a rich portfolio of newsletters. So I think that, in this moment, that journalism real estate that you're talking about, you're in competition not only with column inches, you're in competition with the internet as a whole.
Right.
And with attention at a premium, it really behooves us to try to stand apart with high quality and those signature, insightful voices that the Times opinion section has been known for.
Are there editorials that appear online that don't necessarily make it to print?
No, very rarely now.
Okay.
We do, occasionally run editorials off the news. So that may be why you were thinking we have three editorials some weeks. Of course, there are just moments, for instance, the fall of Roe, where we want to make sure that we're weighing in on a timely way.
Is some of this just a sense that perhaps the Times any newspaper's editorial voice would be to some degree predictable, and that there's almost no point in stating the obvious? We don't like Donald Trump editorially. I think I get it. Is there some of that involved?
I would say, let me kind of walk you through the process
Sure.
a little bit. And, I'm often asked what role the publisher plays in this, and he does play.
One of my questions.
Okay. He does play a role. He is a great source of guidance and support as we put our editorials together each week about the issues of the day. My colleague Jyoti Thadam leads the editorial board now. I, with her and a group of editors and writers, come together about once a week, and we talk about what arguments we want to make with the institutional voice, what are the most pressing priorities for the editorial board to weigh in on, and then the writer goes back and does, as I was saying, a lot of reporting and research, as you know well,
Yep.
To craft that piece. I think predictability is a really interesting question. I think about it two ways. One, predictability is actually really key to what we do. As you know, our columnists, for instance, are beloved by our readers who read them very loyally.
And I'm sure some are less beloved than others.
Yes, that's
But there you
true,
go.
of course. But it's really about quality, right? And we want to make sure that when anyone comes to the Times opinion section, they can expect a high level of quality. The other part of that, though, is I do think about wanting to, when, as I was saying, attention is at such a premium, bringing newness and challenge into that daily and weekly rhythm of the print news business as much as we possibly can. And so we've been really working on that through podcasts and editorials and photo essays and so many different mediums.
Right. Sticking for a second with the publisher, A.G. Sulzberger, he's the third generation, he's the fifth generation actually of the Sulzberger family, Sulzberger family to be publisher. Third, that in my long time at the Times, his grandfather, Punch Sulzberger, had a very light hand in regards to editorials. On occasion, he'd weigh in. Perhaps his son, Arthur Oakes Sulzberger Jr., a bit more. I assume in the end we're not going to make a major endorsement of a mayor, a governor, president without the publisher's input. But in the day-to-day stuff, I trust he's not involved that much, right?
Obviously, AG is my boss. He's
Right.
an incredible journalist himself.
No, he was a wonderful writer.
And he has been a wonderful partner to me. We work a few times a year talking about editorial targets. So the targets we set for this year, for instance, include the crisis of democracy that I think is undeniable at this point in the United States. Looking at America's role in the broader world, particularly as the Biden administration took over,
Right.
and of course, in light of things like the Ukraine conflict. Then we've been looking a lot at domestic infrastructure. That includes things like COVID response. We have been set as a priority looking at the addiction treatment and mental health. And then we also have made free speech one of the signature issues that we want to weigh in this year.
Sarah Palin sued the Times over an editorial that I guess it's about 5 years ago that inaccurately portrayed her views on guns. And as soon as the error was spotted, it was amended, and there was an editorial correction. And I assume that went far to Ms. Palin losing her suit against the Times. In fact, the judge said that even if the jury came back with a guilty verdict, he was going to toss it. Because it was clear with that correction that there was no malice intended as defined under the key Supreme Court ruling for this, as you know, in the 1964 New York Times v. Sullivan case. Nonetheless, we now have at least two justices on the Supreme Court, Gorsuch and Thomas, saying they'd like to revisit Times v. Sullivan. Any sense of how much in danger press freedoms, as we've understood them for half a century or more, are?
Yeah. For starters, I think it's actually pretty important to recognize that verdict, which was, of course, a welcome one,
Sure.
and a reaffirmation of one of the most fundamental tenets in American law, which is that public figures should not try to intimidate or step in the way of journalism and the truth. And so, you know, I was not at the Times when that editorial was written, but of course I had colleagues who were, and so my main role in that trial was supporting them. But Clyde, as you know, one of the most brilliant, diligent, and perhaps under-recognized teams at the New York Times is our legal department.
Yes.
Helmed by Diane Braden and David McCraw. They are constantly on top of trying to make sure that the Times journalists can do their jobs, but really that journalism as a practice can be carried out throughout the United States and really around the world. And so I think that verdicts like the one in the Palin suit, like the one that we saw even to a certain extent in the defamation suit that between Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, they're always paying close attention to that. They're always looking at what we need to do next. It increasingly feels, and I'm sure you recognize this as well, that the idea of being able to gather facts and do journalism in the way that we are trained is coming under pressure, and it's harder and harder. And so I feel great knowing that you know that team is watching out for us.
But again, do the Gorsuch, Thomas, let's revisit that key decision. Is there a sense that indeed some of the bedrock principles we've all labored under for more than half a century are in peril?
Well, it's pretty impossible to read the tea leaves on what the court is going to do at this point. You know, I wouldn't want to make any predictions here, but I do know that the Times is going to do everything that we can to make sure those bedrock principles stay in place.
Does it matter to you as editor, the opinion editor, and a new title as opposed to editorial page editor, since obviously it's more than just the editorial page, does it matter to you that we're often not successful in our endorsements? I'm thinking of Presidents Klobuchar and Warren, for example. Okay, we said, or is that really not an issue as far as you see it?
Ouch! Luckily I am pretty good at brushing myself off. You know, I think that endorsements are an interesting question. Of course, as you know, the division between news and opinion is real, and we do, when we endorse candidates, we're not necessarily trying to pick the winner, and of course we don't always pick the winner. We're trying to choose the best person for what we see for the job. And if you look, for instance, in the New York mayoral endorsements last year, we chose Catherine Garcia.
Right.
She obviously didn't win, but our endorsement did help her rocket up in the polls and gave her a fighting chance. And now she plays a really prominent role in the Hochul administration. And I think that is a really important part of what we do as well. You mentioned my title. I think that I am the Times First Opinion editor as opposed to editorial page editor, and that's really an effort at clarity. Over the last year or so, we've been trying to ratchet down across our report any use of journalism jargon, and of course, it recognizes the diversity of the opinion section today, and really is an effort to go beyond the editorial page and print.
All right, fair enough. You heard it here. Thank you, Kathleen Kingsbury. I'd like to note, by the way, that the Times has lost one of the greatest writers and reporters it ever had, Francis X. Kleins, who for a stretch was on the editorial board and a colleague of both of ours. And Kathleen had a wonderful reflection on Frank in Thursday's paper. Do take a look. Frank died this week at 84. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Clyde Haberman. Thank you for watching.